Hi, everyone. So today we are going to talk all about the green card process because people ask me all the time, what is the process? How does this work? This is my situation. How do I go through and get my green card? So let's talk about it. If you have questions, put them in the comments. I'm happy to respond and let's get into it. I'm attorney Lillian Chukura. I'm a US based immigration lawyer and I help my clients get green cards and citizenships for themselves and their families using the US immigration law system. So, the first thing I want to cover with you is the different ways that you can actually get a green card. And that's really important because when you're going through this process, you want to make sure that you are filing for the right process. All right. So, you can get a green card through employment, through family, of course, through humanitarian reasons. So, humanitarian reasons will be asylum, U visa, T visa, things like that. Um, and then there's also self sponsored investment visas. Okay. So you have your employment base, which is where you most likely will have an employer filing for you to get the visa. Then you have your family base, which means you have a US citizen or permanent resident relative that can file for you. And then the humanitarian is the asylum, refugee status, T visa, U visa, VAWA, and of course the investor. So if you have enough money to invest in the US, you can get a green card in the US. So it's really important to know the different types of ways to get a green card so that when you're starting the process, you make sure that you are going through the right path. You don't want to get to the end after you paid all the fees and realize, oh, wait, this is the wrong thing, right? You don't want either the US Embassy or an officer at USCIS to deny your case and say, well, this is the wrong thing to file. So you want to make sure that you start with that first step of making sure you have the right status, right? You're applying for the right status. If you're joining me and you have questions as I'm going through this, please put it in the comments. I am more than happy to respond to your questions. So let's start with the employment base. How does that work? So typically with an employment based visa, you have a US employer, right? You have a job offer and they want to file for you to get a green card and stay permanently in the US. Now, just because the job is filing for you doesn't mean that you are obligated to work for them forever. Okay. Because sometimes people get scared of that and they think, okay, if I go with this job offer, do I have to only work for that company? Well, for depending on the type of visa, you may have some years that you have to work for the company. However, you are not obligated to work for them forever. So just know that. So when you're talking to employers, you know what your requirements are. So the employer will file a labor certification. A labor certification is basically the employer saying, we need this position, right? We have a position available. We have put in ads for this position. No qualified US employee has applied for this position, but we have this person that qualifies for the position, meets all the requirements for the position, and we would like to hire them. And then the US Labor Department will look at the application and set the amount that the employer has to pay the person. So again, the employer is leading the charge with the employment base. They have to agree to pay a certain amount to that person. So it's called a prevailing wage. That's key there. The prevailing wage. So a US employer cannot just hire someone and pay them below minimum wage. No. If they're going through a labor certification, they're telling the US government that they're going to pay them the market rate for that position. So once that's approved and they agree to that, they will then file an I-140 for the person they want to have in this position. Once they file that and it's approved, then they can start with either the green card application or the visa application, depending on if the employee is inside the US or outside of the US. So if you're inside the US and you're in current status, you're able to then go to the green card process in the US. So typically, when I say you need to be in status, I mean you need to have some form of legal status in the US. Typically, this would be like you're currently on an H-1B and the company wants to now get you the green card, or you're an F-1 student and you're going to be starting a position that they're willing to file for you to get a green card. So you must have some form of status to change to a green card within the US. Okay. For employment based, you must have a status that you are adjusting from. So keep that in mind, okay? If you're overstayed your visa, you may not be able to get a green card in the US through employment based. That's the key there. So you apply for the green card, you get approved, you get your card. That's the process for that. Again, for the first two sections, the labor certification, the I-140, the employer is really taking charge and has to meet certain requirements. And then for the green card application, you, the employee, is the one that has to meet the requirements for a green card. Okay. Now let's talk about family-based. So family-based petitions are very broad, right? So who can actually file for people? U.S. citizens and permanent residents can file for certain family members. U.S. citizens can file for their spouse, their parents, their children, all their children, whether they're married, unmarried, over 21, under 21, doesn't matter. They can file for their children, they can file for their siblings, and they can file for a fiance. A permanent resident can only file for their children, unmarried children. So once their child gets married, they can no longer file for them. A permanent resident can also file for their spouse. That's it. So because we know that a permanent resident can only file for their unmarried children and their spouse, it limits who they can file for. And I typically tell people, if you have married children, if you know you want to eventually file for your parents to come to the US, file for your citizenship as soon as you can, because that opens up more people that you can file for to get status in the US. So let's take a US citizen. So a US citizen can file for their relatives. And those relatives, if they are considered immediate relatives, right? Immediate relatives of US citizens are their spouse, their children that are unmarried and under the age of 21, and their parents. Those are the only immediate relatives for US citizens. So in those situations, excuse me, an immediate relative of a US citizen can get a green card in the US even if they overstay their visa. And that's really important because if the person overstayed their visa and they can't get an employment based green card because, again, they overstayed, you need to be in valid status to get an employment based visa, and they have a US citizen spouse, that overstay is waived. So that's the really great part about that. So if you're an immediate relative, this is your process for a green card. Your spouse, if you're in the US, your US citizen immediate relative can file an I-130 and an I-485 for you. And the reason they're doing that is the I-130 is the relative petition. The 485 is the actual green card application. You have to file both of those. You file it with USCIS. You wait for that to be processed. Once it's approved, now you have your green card. If you are the child of a US citizen or a permanent resident and you are unmarried, but you are over the age of 21, your process is going to be, they're going to file the I-130, then you have to wait for a visa to become available. So you are in a preference category, okay? You must wait for a visa to become available. So even if the I-130 is approved, you cannot move on to the green card stage until there's a visa available. Unfortunately, this means there is going to be years of waiting for that green card to become available. Okay. And if you're in that situation and you're physically in the US, that means you need to maintain your status. So let's say you came in on a visiting visa and you want to stay until the green card, until you can apply for the green card, based on, being the child over 21 of a US citizen or a permanent resident. Well, you will need to have some form of status. So what some people do is they may switch from a a visiting visa to a student visa, and they want to go to school in the US and they continue their education. They may be in undergrad, so they finish that. They may choose to do OPT after the schooling. They may choose to do a master's degree, a PhD, something to keep them in status. And then once a visa becomes available for them to be able to apply for a green card, they go ahead and apply for their green card, have their interview if necessary, and they're able to get their green card. If you're outside of the US and you're going through that process, your US citizen or permanent resident relative will go ahead and file the I-130, wait for that to be approved, and sent to the National Visa Center. The National Visa Center will let you know when it's time for you to actually start filling out the forms based on when there's a visa available. Immediate relatives of US citizens always, always have a visa available. Okay? Immediate relatives of US citizens always has a visa available. They don't have to wait for any time frame from when the National Visa Center gets their file to when they can actually apply for the green card. Okay, so once the National Visa Center gets the file, you can start filing the DS-260 and the affidavit of support. And then you wait. So there's a bunch of waiting here because you wait for the I-130 to be approved. You wait for the case to be at the National Visa Center. If you're not an immediate relative of a US citizen, you wait for a visa to become available. Then once a visa becomes available and you fill out all the forms, you wait for an interview to be scheduled. Okay, so there is some waiting that goes through when you're not in the US. Yes, there's waiting when you're in the US and in status, or you're an immediate relative that overstayed their visa. But if you are outside of the US, the wait is going to be significantly longer. Now, let's talk about how you can get your green card if you have not overstayed your visa, right? You came in without inspection and you don't know what to do. One, you must, excuse me, in order to get your green card, when you came in without authorization, you must have one of these things. You must have either a US citizen or permanent resident spouse, or a US citizen or permanent resident parent. Those are the two ways that you can actually be able to get your green card if you came in without authorization. Because if you came in without authorization, you can do your I-130. You can then apply for a waiver. In order to apply for a waiver to waive the fact that you came in without inspection, you're going to need a US citizen or permanent resident spouse or parent. So that's why that's the first consideration. Do you have this person that would be a qualifying relative for the waiver? If you don't, then you need to stop and think about the other ways that you can get status without having entered with inspection. And I'm going to talk about those next. So from there, once you have your waiver approved, you can go through the National Visa Center, go to your interview, and then be able to come back into the US with your green card. If you came into the US, but let's say, for example, you use someone else's visa to come into the US, that does happen, okay? That definitely does happen where people will come into the US with, I'm sorry, y'all, getting over a cold here, but you come into the US with someone else's visa, and now you're married to a US citizen and you want to get your green card. Well, you can still do it, but you'll need a waiver. And the waiver, just like someone that entered without inspection, is still going to require you to have your US citizen or permanent resident spouse, or a US citizen or permanent resident parent that's going to suffer extreme hardship. Now, if you only have US citizen children that are able to file for you, the question may then be, are they able to file for, like, let's say, your spouse to get their status, and then your spouse can file for you? There's so many considerations to think about there, but you may qualify for a humanitarian ground. Excuse me. A humanitarian ground would be a VAWA, asylum, U visa, T visa. So VAWA is based on abuse. So if you have been abused by your US citizen or permanent resident spouse, children, parents, those that's where that would come in. If you entered without inspection, it doesn't matter for VAWA purposes. You can still get your green card through VAWA, even if you entered without inspection. Okay, that it gets waived. If you entered with someone else's visa, you can still file under VAWA. You will just need a waiver. And the good thing about, if your if your VAWA is approved, and okay, if your VAWA is approved, but you entered with someone else's visa and you need to apply for a waiver, you do not need a qualifying relative. You don't need a US citizen or permanent resident spouse or parent in order to get the waiver for the green card under the VAWA. Okay, so that's the good thing about that. The T visa is for people that were labor trafficked or sex trafficked. If that is approved, you will then eventually be able to apply for a green card, and your entry without inspection, entering with someone else's passport or anything like that, or overstaying, is going to be waived under the VAWA, the T, and the U visa. And then for the U, you need to show that you were a victim of a qualifying crime. And if you can show that and your U visa is approved, you are also able to apply for a waiver for entering without inspection. Basically, anything that you have done that's against US immigration law, except for certain crimes, you're able to ask for a waiver for under the U visa. So that's another great thing. If you don't have anything else, if you don't qualify for a T visa, if you don't qualify under family, then a U visa may be an option that would work for you. And once those are approved, you are eventually able to apply for a green card. Once the green card is approved, you can get your card. And then typically 5 years after that, you can get your citizenship. Now, let's talk about investment. So when you have a certain amount of money, okay, when you have a certain amount of money, you are able to basically invest in the US and get a green card. And the amount of money is typically between, excuse me, it's typically between $800,000 and 1.3 million. Okay. If you have that kind of money, you are able to get you and your relatives a green card. So, and by relatives, I mean your spouse and your minor children. Okay. Your spouse and your unmarried children under 21 can also get a green card if you qualify for that investor visa. So that's 800,000 up to 1.3 million. Okay. If you have that, you can apply. You have to, of course, show that what you're investing in and that it's going to produce at least 10 US based jobs. Okay. So if you're building your business plan for this visa type, make sure that you are building in the capacity for 10 employees, because if you don't have that, your visa can be revoked. Okay. So keep that in mind, and your green card can be rescinded. So you want to make sure that you're meeting all the requirements for the investor visa. You have to show that you have the funds, or you're able to immediately get the funds to invest. So if you have any questions, put them in the comments. If you're finding this helpful so far, go ahead and like this video and share it, because people want to know how to get a green card, what the process is like, depending on the type of green card you qualify for. Like I said, it comes in different flavors: family, employment, investor, humanitarian. So if you fit into one of those and you're able to apply for a green card under that, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to assist you. But remember, for the employment based, I have to say this multiple times because people forget. For employment based, for investor, for anyone that's not an immediate relative of a US citizen that wants to get their green card in the US, you must be in valid status when you apply for your green card. Okay, if you're already out of status, if you entered without inspection or any of that, it's going to be much harder for you. So feel free to ask me questions. I am more than happy to respond. And also, just a quick plug for next Friday. It is our monthly Q&A, because I am taking some time off the last 2 weeks of the year. So the last 2 weeks of this month, I'm taking Fridays off. So we're not going to have our lives the last 2 Fridays. However, next week is the Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the comments. I will be answering those. If you have questions and you want to join me live and ask me your questions, please do that. I like talking to you all. And if you don't want to ask your questions in a public forum like YouTube, feel free to send me a message. I'm on Facebook, Instagram. DM me your question and just put that it's for the Friday Q&A, and I will be more than happy to answer it on the live stream. All right. If you would like a strategy session with me where we talk about your particular immigration issue and how we can help you solve it, feel free to do that by going to my website, lilylegal.com, and picking a date and time that works best for you for us to speak. And you can also call my office at 508-443-1788 to schedule that strategy session. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you next week for the Q&A. Bye.